What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today we're going to be discussing the brand new Abhyss Archetype that's set to be released in the next deck building set, Ancient Guardians. This is also the one that has the polar bears in mech suits in space, so if you missed that video, I'll have a link up on screen or down in the description. But this is an archetype that people have been really looking forward to because reptiles, let's just say, have not been the most generously supported archetype over the years, and people are looking for an excuse to play Snake Rain and buy it out. So let's go ahead and get right into it. I am very excited to see what this archetype is all about, and hopefully it is actually decent. So first of all, can I just say the artwork on this card, and probably all these cards from what I've seen so far, is just fantastic. Like the Egyptian, like golden lotus, like snakes, like I just love it. Anything like Egyptian themed, I mean, it's Yu-Gi-Oh, right? So I guess it's fitting, but I just love it. It's absolutely fantastic. Bit of a throwback as well. So first up, we have Null, Dreg of the Abyss. So it's a light reptile effect monster with 0 attack and defense. It's level 4. You can only use this card's first and second effects once per turn each. You can send this card from your hand to the graveyard, send one dark reptile monster from your deck to the graveyard. Okay, so he's light. You get to send a dark chaos synergy potentially. This is a bit of like a Tri-Brigade Fractal sort of effect. We're pretty familiar with this, but that seems like a pretty good setup to start. The second effect reads, if you control no monsters or you control an Abhyss monster, you can special summon this card from your graveyard, but banish it when it leaves the field. You cannot special summon monsters while this card special summoned by this effect is in the monster zone, except reptile monsters. Okay, so that last part isn't really too bad if we're only going to be playing reptile monsters for the most part, but this is pretty nice. This is like a great starter. You can pitch it from your hand to send another one, and then you can immediately bring it back on turn 1 because you're not going to have any monsters, and then that's just going to allow you to start for some initial setup plays. So, all right, already looking pretty good. I would say, I mean, if there's a starter, this could be it. I guess we'll have to see as we go down along here. Next up is Nihil, Dreg of the Abyss. Again, this artwork is just so cool. I love the golden lotus, like the black with the gold in the artworks are just fantastic. This is a dark reptile effect, 0 attack, 2000 defense, so we got a big booty snake here. Level 4, you can only use the first and second effects once per turn each. You can send this card from your hand to the graveyard, send one light reptile monster from your deck to the graveyard. Okay, so this just does the opposite of our friend Null up here, and I think you would want to play both of these because I think Null, if Null is the starter, since Nihil can actually get to Null because you can just send the Null off of Nihil, then I think you would really want to play both of these because it's like you're playing 6 ways to get to Null essentially. So okay, not bad. If this card's no more special summon, you can add one Abhyss spell or trap from your deck to your hand. Okay, so this could be good. Anytime you have something that can search for any of the in-archetype spells and traps, it's usually good. It obviously depends on how good those are, so we'll see as we get down a little bit later. Next up, oh man, this card looks so cool. It's like an Anubis, but it just like with like some weird like armor. Oh my god, that's just awesome. So this is Flogi, Haze of the Abyss. I probably butchered the name on that. It's a light reptile effect, level 4, 1800 attack, 1400 defense, so decent body. You can only use this card's name's first and second effects once per turn each. If this card is sent from the field to the graveyard or special summoned from the graveyard, you can target a face-up monster your opponent controls and one monster in their graveyard with an attack equal or higher attack, special summon the target in the opponent's graveyard to their field, and if you do, send the target they control to the graveyard. I don't know how I feel about this card. You never really want to give your opponent advantage, although I guess you're not really giving them advantage because you're kind of just like swapping something out. You're giving them a monster from their graveyard and then sending a monster on their field to the graveyard. So depending on what type of deck they're playing, this could be good, but it requires the monster in the graveyard to have an equal or higher attack than whatever it is that you're targeting on the field. That seems a bit conditional. The second effect says, if this card is in your graveyard, you can send one card from your hand to the graveyard, add this card to your hand. So this is kind of cool because not only can you get this card back, but also it allows you to have another way to get some of these cards into the graveyard, which I think is probably the bigger purpose here, depending on what some of the cards are. So I guess that's fine. The effect is weird to say the least. I don't really know how I feel about it. Next up, oh man, the cool artwork continues. This is Zoha, Haze of the Abyss. This is a dark reptile effect, level 4, 1500 attack, 1700 defense. You can only use this card's name's first and second effects once per turn each. First effect reads, if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard or special summon from the graveyard, you can have your opponent draw one card, and if they do, you add one Abhyss monster from your deck to your hand, except Zoha, then each player sends one card from their hand to the graveyard. Okay, so again, here we go with these weird sort of replacement effects. This time it's for your opponent's hand and not their field, but this is really bad. You never want your opponent to draw a card unless it is absolutely essential, and basically Dark World dealings for both players on this monster's effect, although to be fair, you specifically get to add an Abhyss monster to your hand, and I think you sending a card from your hand to the graveyard is mitigated by this archetype because you want these monsters in the graveyard. So I would say in a vacuum, this is supposed to be a net positive for you. The problem is, contextually, most players have cards in their deck that they want into the graveyard, whether it's for some sort of graveyard setup or because there's synergy or interaction. So I don't think you're actually getting as much as it might seem, and I think that's a big problem. The second effect, I think, is the same as the other card. If this card's in your graveyard, you can send a card from your hand to the graveyard, add this card to your hand. So I'm not too sure about this one. Again, Dark World dealings, it's weird, and you think you'd want to get the synergy off of this, especially because this is like your searcher of the deck, but I don't know. We're gonna have to see what the rest of this archetype has before we make any decisions here. Next up is Curse, Dawn of the Abyss, and just the artwork on these cards just keeps getting cooler and cooler. 10 out of 10 on that. It's a light reptile effect, level 8, 400 attack, 2400 defense, and you can only use this card's first and second effects once per turn each. If this card is in your graveyard, you can tribute a monster, special summon this card, then your opponent can special summon a monster from their graveyard to their field, but its effects are negated. Oh my god, that's not good. This isn't even like a break-even sort of effect like those other two monsters were. This is actually giving your opponent a plus, and that's just really, really bad. Now, the one saving grace of this is, think of a card like Gillosaurus, right? We've seen Gillosaurus in a myriad of decks in the past, and Gillosaurus is a pretty bad downside, but if it's turn 1 and your opponent doesn't have anything in the graveyard, then this effect is okay, because then they're not going to get any sort of benefit off of it. But after turn 1, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. So it's weird. It's weird, but we'll see what the rest of this does. So if this card is special summoned, you can target a level 4 lower Abhyss monster in your graveyard, special summon it, but banish it when it leaves the field. Okay, so this allows you to at least generate a plus of your own if this card is brought out. Although, to be fair, you had to tribute something to special summon this, so unless you're special summoning it through a different means, then it's I don't know. This right here, then your opponent can special summon a monster from their graveyard. This is a massive downside. Yeah, its effects are negated, but that doesn't matter. I mean, a lot of the time you could just basically take anything just for free link material, Xyz material. There's so many ways that this could go wrong. I'm not feeling too good about this. Let's go ahead and move on though. Oh my god, and the artwork just keeps getting cooler. This is a really awesome looking one here. This is Aleph, Dusk of the Abyss. So it's a dark reptile effect, level 8, 2000 attack, 800 defense. You can only use the first and second effects once per turn each. If this card is in your graveyard, you can tribute a monster, special summon this card, then your opponent can add one monster from their graveyard to their hand. Okay, so this is similar to the other one, except the card's going to their hand instead of being special summoned to their field. That could be good or bad, depending on what your opponent is playing. It could be bad because if your opponent used a hand trap prior to you using this effect, then they can add the hand trap back to their hand, and they have that for another turn, and that's really bad. But if it's like a monster that's not really going to do anything in their hand, then that's kind of okay. But it's still not great. You don't want to give your opponent resources if you absolutely can. If this card's special summon, you can target 2 of your banished monsters, including at least a reptile monster, return them to the graveyard. So we have seen a few cards that do banish after the resolution of their effects if they leave the field again, if they're resurrected a second time. This allows you to recycle them, and in the instance of something like, I believe the first one up here, I think the null actually banishes itself. Yes, banish it when it leaves the field. So if you actually get null back in the graveyard, then you can actually special summon it again and kind of get the whole chain going again. So there could be a reason to play a utility one of this, so that way you can actually get your resources cycling again. Interesting. All right, let's move on along. Oh my god, this artwork on these cards is so cool. It's so awesome, dude. I love it. So this is Aeron, King of the Abyss. It's a light reptile effect, 2500 attack, 2800 defense, level 8. You can only use the first, second, and third effects of this card once per turn each. If this card is in your graveyard, you can tribute 2 monsters, special summon this card. Okay, the fact that you have to tribute 2 monsters to commit yourself into this, this card better win you the game automatically. If your opponent adds a card to their hand except during the draw phase, you can send one random card from their hand to the graveyard. So that's a Dark Law clause, which is really neat. The problem is you don't have a floating Macrocosmos on the field, so the downside is it's not going to get banished. And so them sending a random card from their hand to the graveyard, if it's a monster, most of the time that's going to benefit them because it'll get some sort of advantage. It's like when we talked about the other card, why we don't want to have them doing any sort of Dark Ward dealings effects. This is basically the same thing. However, Chaos Dragon Legionnaire sees play. People use the hand rip effect all the time. If you hit something like a powerful spell card, then the effect can actually be really strong. If a monster your opponent controls is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can add a light or dark reptile monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand, except Aron, King of the Abyss. So, okay, I mean, that's pretty likely that that's going to happen. There's plenty of cards in the game that will send monsters to the graveyard via card effect. So, I mean, you get to generate some advantage there, but you already committed so many resources into this. You rip a card out of your opponent's hand, you then get to add a card back. So, like, if you achieve all three effects, you technically break even on this card, and then the longer it stays out, the more value that this card generates. But tributing two monsters, that's just so steep. I'm not sure if there's like any way to like incorporate Lair of Darkness into this deck, because then you might be able to mitigate the cost a little, but that actually wouldn't be too bad, because then if you're special summoning a monster to their field with this one, then you can Lair of Darkness and then use it as part of the requirement to tribute summon for the bigger guys. Maybe that's how you're supposed to go about this. I'm not too sure, but let's go ahead and move on. We have Amnesia, Queen of the Abyss. It's a dark reptile effect, level 8, 2700 attack, 2100 defense. You can only use this card's name's first, second, and third effects once per turn each. If this card is in your graveyard, you can tribute two monsters, special summon this card. Okay, we know that already. If a monster is special summoned from your opponent's graveyard, you can send one card they control to the graveyard. Interesting. So this actually kind of makes the downside of this card here a little bit more manageable, because then if you're bringing something back, but you already have Amnesia up, then you can just immediately send whatever was brought back to their graveyard, so they kind of break even. The problem is you have to actually get these on the field first, so I'm still failing to see how you're going to do that. And then the third effect, if a monster is sent from your opponent's hand or deck to the graveyard, you can special summon a light or dark reptile monster from your graveyard, except Amnesia, Queen of the Abyss. That's really strong. I mean, again, being able to special summon monsters, I mean, that's very similar to this one up here that's able to get monsters back. It is a bit conditional, but I don't think it's too ridiculous and like out of the realm of possibility that a monster is going to be sent from your opponent's hand or deck to the graveyard. Think about how many cards in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Especially have that sort of effect. So you're going to most likely be able to get this off. But again, it does require your opponent to like jump through hoops and trigger the effects themselves, which is a bit unfortunate. So hopefully there's some ways to mitigate that. And oh baby, there's the big boss monster himself. It is Ogdo Abyss, Deity of the Abyss. Probably completely butchered the name of that, but it's a light reptile effect, level 10, 3100 attack, 2200 defense. You can only use the first and second effects once per turn each. If this card is in your graveyard, you can tribute 3 monsters to special summon this card. Okay, let's be honest. There has to be no conceivable way you're going to summon this card by tributing 3 monsters. Like, that just seems like the biggest investment imaginable. Unless this card wins you the game automatically, I don't see it. So let's read the second effect. Once while face up on the field, quick effect, you can send all monsters on the field to the graveyard except face up monsters that were special summoned from the graveyard. I guess, like, that's good, but why is it only once while it's face up on the field, I guess is my question. We have a card like Zeus, which is infinitely easier to summon, and that can do it multiple times, and it's all cards. This is just all monsters, and I guess it's everything except face up monsters that are special summoned from the graveyard, but the problem with that is you can possibly, with this archetype, summon monsters out of your opponent's graveyard to their field, which means this won't affect that wipe. I don't know. I don't think you're going to be summoning this by tributing 3 monsters. That's all I'm going to say. There's got to be ways you can bring this out, whether it's through Amnesia, whether it's through this one right here, Curse. Oh no, Curse is only level 4 or lower, so you can't even summon this off of Curse. Okay, so it has to be like specifically Amnesia for you to be able to do that. Oh man, I don't know. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Let's see what else we got. So we have Depths of the Abyss. It's a field spell. Again, cool artwork. You can only use this card's name first and second effects once per turn each. If a face-up reptile monster you control is destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect, you can target one card your opponent controls, send it to the graveyard. Okay, so not bad. I mean, there are ways that this can be dodged, because think about how many effects in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are going to be sending cards to the graveyard, not destroying them. Think about cards that are bouncing cards back to the opponent's hand, or like the extra deck. I mean, it's not impossible to see stuff being destroyed by battle or by opponent's card effect, but I mean, are you going to want to play this as like a do-nothing card just so that happens? I'm not exactly sure that's the case. If this card in your field zone is destroyed by an opponent's card effect, you can send cards from the top of your opponent's deck to the graveyard equal to the number of reptile monsters with different names in your graveyard. Okay, that's just awful. Again, we've talked about and reiterated in this video that we don't want to send cards and our opponent's resources to the graveyard, because most likely they can generate some sort of advantage off of it and get extra extenders when they otherwise wouldn't be able to. I don't see why you would want to do this. It also has to be destroyed by an opponent's card effect. So again, I don't know why your opponent would like purposely destroy it, unless they want to mill themselves because it benefits them. Think if you're playing a deck like Eldritch or something. Yeah, I think the field spell is probably the weakest that we've seen out of all the cards on here. I mean, you guys know that I love field spells. As long as they generate you advantage immediately on activation, those are the best types of field spells. This card does not do that, and I think this card has way too many drawbacks. I don't think it's that good, but we shall move on. Next up is Emptiness of the Abyss. Again, fantastic artwork. Continuous Trap. You can only use this card name's first effect once per turn. During the main phase, you contribute one reptile monster, then target one monster in your opponent's graveyard, special summon it to your field, but send it to the graveyard during the end phase. So this is interesting because this is actually a way to interact with your opponent's graveyard. We know how strong cards like DD Crow and Ice Dragon's Prison and the like are at the moment, so we have a way to not only interact with the opponent's graveyard, but we actually get the monster in addition to that. It does require us to tribute our own reptile, but as long as this continuous trap stays face up, we can do this every single turn. We can do this during our opponent's turn to disrupt them, but we can also do it during our own turn in addition to that, and so that's actually not bad. And then if this face-up card is in the spell and trap zone, is sent to the graveyard, send all face-up non-reptile monsters you control to the graveyard. Okay, so this is kind of like the downside to playing this card, so anything you special summon off of this is just going to get sent back to your opponent's graveyard, most likely, unless you're playing like a mirror match or something. So I mean, because most likely your opponent's not playing reptiles, let's be honest. That's like whatever. I think that's like a fair downside. I don't even think that matters that much because it gets sent to the graveyard during the end phase anyway. So unless your opponent really wants that card back in their graveyard, I guess there's a way for them to get to it. That's a weird one, but the graveyard interaction on this card is pretty cool. And then next up is Invasion of the Abyss. Again, cool artwork. It's a normal trap this time. You can only activate one card with this card's name per turn. Special summon 2 Abyss tokens, which are Reptile Dark level 2 0 attack and defense tokens, and if you have 8 or more Abyss monsters with different names in your graveyard, you can apply this effect instead. Special summon 2 reptile monsters with different names from your graveyard. Now that second effect is interesting, but the issue is you have to have 8 or more Abyss monsters with different names. If it was just 8 or more Abyss monsters in general, then I would say this card might be playable, because if you have something like Snake Rain, you're already getting 5 reptiles in the graveyard, and then you just need to get a couple more. That's not too difficult, and then you have a double monster reborn, so that's actually pretty cool. But the fact that they need different names, I just don't think that that's worth it. So overall, this archetype is interesting, to say the least. One of the best things about this archetype that I will say is that there's no limitations really on what you're able to splash this with. There are a couple cards that restrict you in your summoning at times to only being able to go into like having reptile monsters on your field or go into like reptile monsters. But for the most part, this deck is actually fairly open-ended, and I really like that, because if you want to splash in some chaos monsters for chaos synergy, you actually can do that. If you want to splash in some other like fodder to be able to get tribute monsters on the field, so that way you can sack them for like the bigger cards, you can also do that as well. The fact that the text on these cards doesn't preclude you from playing a lot of other cards in the game means that there is the potential for something to come of this, and we can't really underestimate these types of decks, because I mean, think back to Secret Slayers. A lot of people thought Adamantipator and Eldritch weren't going to be that great right out of the gate, myself included, and they ended up being some of the strongest decks of the past year or so. So it isn't unrealistic to think that someone can find a way to make this archetype work as well. The only like first initial combination I was able to come up with off the top of my head as I was reading through these is like you can, okay, so let's say you Snake Rain, right? Because if you Snake Rain, you can dump a bunch of these into the graveyard. So Snake Rain plus any of like the monsters that I'm thinking of here, I think should be able to do this. If you go Snake Rain, send like a bunch of snakes, and then you get this one specifically, you resurrect this one to the field, then you can tribute this one for the one tribute one that revives one. So here, right here, Curse. Curse requires you to tribute a monster, and then since it's turn 0, your opponent won't get to special summon a monster, so there's no downside. But then because it was special summoned, you get to target a level 4 lower Abyss and bring it out. So then you can bring out the this one, the Nihil. Nihil can then add an Abyss spell or trap, and then you can grab the trap card here to interrupt your opponent's graveyard. And then the last card, I think from there, since you have 2 reptiles now, you can tribute them both for Amnesia because it requires 2 monsters on the field. And then your end board would be something like Amnesia plus the trap. And then you have multiple forms of interruption, because if a monster is sent from your opponent's hand or deck to the graveyard, you can special summon a light or dark reptile monster from your graveyard. So then the 5th snake that you would send, so as long as you have the big guy, Amnesia, you have the Curse, and then you have both of the little ones. You have Null and Nihil. So that's 5. So as long as you have Snake Rain plus any one of these 5, you can just send the other 4 to do this. And then Amnesia says if a monster is sent from your opponent's hand or deck to the graveyard, you can special summon a light or dark. So then you can bring out the big guy here, which can then send all monsters on the field to the graveyard at quick effect speed. And then you also have the Trap, which says during the main phase, you can tribute a reptile, target a monster in your opponent's graveyard, special summon it, but then send it to the graveyard during the end phase. You have some graveyard interruption, but then you also have the effect here that says if a monster is special summoned from your opponent's graveyard, you can send one card they control to the graveyard as well. So that's just like a simple combo that ends in a way for you to send a card to the graveyard. You have a way to also disrupt their graveyard, and then you have a card that can send all cards on the field to the graveyard in addition to that. That's like okay, I guess. That's just like the tip of the iceberg for this deck. I mean, it can hopefully only all go up from here. The last thing I wanted to do was talk about some of the more generic reptile support cards, just so you guys can familiarize yourselves with them and start coming up with some ideas yourselves. Okay, so there's probably more than this, but these are like the most generic cards that caught my eye because of their power level. And so if there's anything else, be sure to let me know down in the comments what else you might think synergize with this archetype. Snake Rain, for people who've never seen this card, it's super overhyped, but for this deck, it's actually pretty good. You discard a card and select 4 reptile monsters from your deck and send them to the graveyard. That goes along with the play that I was talking about earlier. This is going to be like the key of the deck. The problem is, I think that this is just going to lose to Ash Blossom immediately, so then you just might lose the game. So who knows? Evi Dragon Ananta is actually a really interesting card. It can't be normal summoned or set. It cannot be special summoned except by removing from play all reptile monsters from your side of the field and graveyard, and it gains attack and defense equal to the number of monsters removed times 600, and during each of your end phases, you just destroy a card on the field. So it's like, it's a dark level 8, so if there is any sort of like rank 8 synergy or dark synergy, like even as a one-of, just being able to have this like gigantic colossal beater, especially with how quickly you can get these cards in the graveyard, who knows, this could be something you might want to tech in. King of the Feralimps, people know this from Pendulum, but this just requires any 2 level 4s, which there are a lot of level 4s in this deck, and once per turn, you can detach an Xyz material and add a reptile monster from your deck to your hand. That's any reptile monster, so that means you can search for the bigger ones as well. Viper's Rebirth is a common card that most people have probably never heard of before. You activate only if all monsters in your graveyard are reptile type. You select a non-tuner monster in your graveyard, special summon it, but destroy it during the end phase. This is a non-once per turn monster reborn that you could play in this deck to allow you to just swarm the field, and I just think that's really, really strong, especially if you're going to be tributing them off or like doing things like that. Then this card could actually be a really nice extender for the archetype. And then lastly, offering to the Snake Deity. You target a face-up reptile monster you control and 2 cards your opponent controls, destroy all 3 targets. So this is like an Icarus attack for reptiles. That's probably the best way to put it. But there are some very good, strong, generic reptile support cards that could maybe supplement this. And again, there's potential chaos synergy. Like you could play Chaos Dragon Levianeer in a deck like this and probably get away with it. And who knows, maybe there's some potential there as well. We'll just have to see. I'm really curious to know what you guys think down in the comments, so so be sure to let me know. So guys, that's going to wrap it up for the video. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon for exclusive early one-day access to both the Yu-Gi-Oh progression series and the history of Yu-Gi-Oh. Thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you next time.